Welcome to Through the Trauma podcast. My name is Amber Larkins, published photographer, storytelling expert, visual artist, entrepreneur, speaker, and coach. This podcast was born from one question: how do I get inspiring stories of triumph out to the people who need to hear them the most? Come with me, enter my world, where lives are getting changed, heroes are getting developed, and greatness is being achieved. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Through the Trauma podcast. I am Amber, your host, and today I have with me Dr. Scott Allen. Now, I just went through his resume of things, and he is super impressive in all of the things that he's done, working in the field of health and human rights. He's worked with children in U.S. immigration detention and has received numerous awards. I won't get into all of those, but we're going to talk about some of that and talk about his personal childhood story, which is about a burn injury that he had. And then he's going to talk about his teenage years and kind of what has led him to triumph. He is now a doctor and has appeared on multiple media channels, and it's just a very impressive resume. Dr. Scott Allen, thank you so much for being here.
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you today.
Why don't you just start by kind of telling us a little bit about yourself, and if there's anything I left out of your bio, feel free to tell us all about that too.
Well, no, the introduction was terrific. I am internal medicine physician is my profession, and I've worked for the last 40 years, generally with vulnerable populations, from a refugee work, which we'll talk a little bit about today, at the beginning of my career. But I've also worked extensively in jails, prisons, immigration detention, in mental health institutions, as well as in the community health centers. And most recently, for the last 10 years, my wife and I run a clinic for adults with developmental disabilities as primary care physicians. And having mentioned that I'm a physician, this would be a good point to make an important disclaimer about today's conversation. And I think we're going to mostly focus, appropriate to the topic of the podcast, on the trauma story of my childhood. So I want listeners to understand that while I have a career of working with refugees and prisoners and immigration detention, very traumatized populations. So I've experienced working with traumatized people, but I'm an internal medicine doctor. That's the kind of doctor who takes care of your diabetes, your high blood pressure, so on and so forth. So that I'm speaking today not as an expert at all until we talk about career and profession and how my childhood experiences led to that. But I'm going to share a very individual story that's worth no more and no less than anyone else's individual survival story.
Awesome. Well, I truly believe that stories have so much power, and just one, it raises awareness. It lets people know that, we're not alone. There's people that have experienced different types of trauma, and sometimes as we experience trauma, we are left with sometimes feeling like completely alone. Like, I'm
Right.
the only one that's experienced this. So sharing stories is so important. And I can't wait to get into yours.
Sure. And let me also just agree with that point. I think, particularly childhood trauma, I think it's the norm, not the exception, that children who experience trauma go many years feeling like they were alone in the experience, or if they do know of others. In my case, as we'll talk about, I did know of a small group of other people who were similarly traumatized, but after my hospitalization, I was remote from them, and otherwise I felt like I was isolated and alone. From the perspective of a 62-year-old man, I now have perspective that many of the people I knew had their own hidden traumas that as a child I wasn't aware of. But that is one of the hard parts of negotiating trauma as a child.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree with you there. And childhood trauma is, to me, it's probably one of the most heartbreaking, because as a child, when your brain is not fully developed, and you're being a doctor, I'm sure you understand this way more than I do, but with the brain not being fully developed, and then you're experiencing this type of trauma, you just don't know how to navigate it, and
Right.
you don't know what to do with it. So it just
Well, you
starts to manifest in our bodies in ways that we don't know how to handle.
and a related point, you cope with the primitive tools for coping that you have as a child. And I think, at least in my own experience, because those childhood crude coping skills got me through the night, so to speak, I held on to them years after I developmentally should not have been using, you know, some of those primitive techniques of surviving. So I think, again, this is a recurring theme in your work and your podcast, but childhood trauma in particular is something that it's a lifelong journey, and you continue to deal with it in new ways as you grow and develop. And that's, I think, a positive thing.
Hmm. You said you think it's a positive thing. How so?
Probably because it's the way we cope as humans. There are people, I think, who have great moments of insight and make great leaps forward in dealing with their own trauma. I'm not saying that doesn't exist, or that I haven't had some of those moments, but I think you cope with as much as you're able to cope with at a certain point to get through to the next step. And then later, when you're ready, or you feel safe, or you have more insight, or you have more wisdom, then you deal with the next level. It's a long journey to find peace. At least it was for me, and I imagine for a lot of your listeners.
Yeah, and I mean, I agree with you. I think it's a positive thing. I mean, trauma is never a positive thing, but you can transform that into positive, because a lot of
Yes.
times it's what pushes us to create new things, to build new things, to make us passionate about the things that we're passionate about. Um, I At least that's how it's been in my life. My trauma I would not have this podcast if I had not gone through the things that I went through.
Yeah,
So,
I agree.
yeah, it can be
To-
a positive when we change our perspective around it. And through doing positive things with our trauma, there is where healing lies.
yes, absolutely. And that's something I think we'll explore more today in our conversation.
Yeah, I'm excited to get into it. So,
Sure.
do you want to start by just kind of sharing your story with us?
Yeah, so obviously, let's go back to the beginning. Well, the very beginning is an early, very happy childhood in northwestern Connecticut. My parents both educators, older brother, two younger sisters. We lived in a rural, wooded part of northwestern Connecticut. Very idyllic childhood. Uh, when I was 10, in that lovely wooded area around my home, my brother and I were lighting a campfire using gasoline as an accelerant, as kids are wont to do, without understanding that the fumes could ignite in the open can that was nearby. The fumes ignited, and the can exploded in my direction, and I was burned over about a third of my body, and spent a good part of 1972 initially in a local hospital, being treated by a physician who just returned from treating burn victims in Vietnam, and was subsequently transferred to the Shriners Hospital in Boston, Burn Hospital for Children. Um, so suffice it to say, that's the thumbnail brief summary of the trauma. But you can imagine, 10 years old, the actual accident itself was about as life-threatening as it could be. I certainly, in the moment, thought I had crossed that line and had died. Not was dying, had, at least that, from inside my perspective, that's what it felt like. So to come through that moment is of course life-changing. But then there's a period of recovery, and eventually, when I find myself in Boston, the Boston Shriners Burn Hospital at that time, the old hospital, which has since been knocked down and rebuilt, had a model that was state of the art at the time, but I think they later rethought. State of the art because it has central nursing station and 15 beds without walls between those, so an open ward half of the beds being tented for infectious reasons, but 15 severely burned children all in one room. The consequence of that is someone is always crying or shrieking 24/7, which I think they eventually figured out was probably not the best. Although it was, it was state of the art in terms of nurses being able to easily observe and quickly respond. That part was good. At the time, remember, it's 1972, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is not even a diagnosis in the DSM. So very early in understanding of the impact of trauma on children, I don't think that was in the forefront of their minds. But anyway, very traumatic space to exist in, and to see all of the other children, most of whom were more severely burned than I was. I come out of that. And by the way, we can return to any part of that you want to explore. But I come out of that and return in the 5th grade to my suburban, peaceful, nurturing community. But I, as you can imagine, feel completely different than I was before the accident. I had pretty pronounced physical scars. Age has faded my facial scars, but the whole right side of my face was burned. In 5th grade, it was a little more obvious. My right arm is somewhat, and my hand is somewhat deformed. So my scars were obvious. It was a small town. Everyone knew that I had been burned. And I got to say, looking back, I think, and particularly the adults, couldn't have been nicer and more supportive. It didn't save me from that feeling of being in isolation as it relates to what I went through. In the book, I share an anecdote where I come back and I'm 10-year-old boys. One of my best friends is asking about the hospital, and they said, "How did they get you dressed every day over the burn scars or when it was open?" And I said, "They didn't. They put a towel over my midsection because my legs are burned, my back's burned, and I lay there in a bed with just a towel on me." And my little 5th grade friend started laughing and pointing at me and saying to the class, "The nurses saw him naked. The nurses saw him naked." And I remember, even at the time, I'm 10 years old, and I thought, what an asshole. Like, that's all you have to say? Really? That's where you're coming from? But it was one of those moments where I just, I realized quite clearly that, I'm now going to be hanging out with to me now, very young people. There's a part of me that grew very old very fast. Mm-hmm. And I got to put up with this, and I got to live in this world and go along and get along. So the challenge from ages 10 to 17 was to fit in, try to be as normal as possible, try to convince everyone else that it was fine because people were concerned, was I fine? And try to convince myself that I was fine. That's part of it too, right? I mean, there's, fake it till you make it. That's one of the primitive strategies of a adolescent.
Kids can be so cruel. Like,
they can be.
And it's like, it's out of innocence. I feel like they can be mean. They just don't know how mean they can how mean that actually is. But for someone that is like yourself going through it, it's like, this is you're already struggling through the, coming back, your new normal. And then to have kids say this, then you struggle with, I can only imagine, probably more. But I'm sure that's just one part of the trauma, like the lasting trauma or the lasting impact of the trauma that you experience through this process.
Absolutely. And probably shouldn't leave that moment without also sharing that there were many friends to balance that one anecdote. I think most of my friends from those years were enormously kind, supportive. But nonetheless, even the ones who were kind and supportive, I knew couldn't understand how I now viewed the world, which was forever changed.
So you come back, you're healed, from the physical, you're not in pain anymore. Or did you still experience nerve pain and things like that?
The worst of it was wrapped up within 2 or 3 years. I would return for a number of surgeries, some of them, painful again. And I had residual pain. But I would say within 2 or 3 years, by the time I'm in junior high school or early high school, physical pain that's behind me. The wounds have healed. The corrective procedures that were going to be performed were done. So yes, ostensibly from the outside, and I did, to outside observers, I readjusted to school. In fact, started doing better academically than I had prior to being burned. So, from the outside, from my parents, who are very wonderful and sensitive people, it looked like I was doing okay.
But inside, were you struggling still?
Yeah, absolutely. At some level, I would say the struggle for me, maybe others would say the same thing, is lifelong. But to jump to age 62, I'm mostly at peace with where I struggle, and I have, any number of supports and strategies and ways to cope. But for me, at least, the biggest adjustment, tectonic adjustment to my way of viewing the world of trauma and the burn hospital was how much suffering there was in the world. And once you see that, and once you learn that, there's no unlearning it or unseeing it. And that, I think, has led to my biggest challenges, but it's also led to the life and career I have lived since then, which I think has been a rewarding one. I know it's been a rewarding one, and I hope I've helped people along the way. So that was the biggest challenge. So I was certainly struggling with that. But if we go back to adolescence, I'm struggling with all the usual adolescent things, but I'm also struggling with how do I operate in a world where I see things that other people don't seem to see or don't want to acknowledge or don't want to deal with. Mm-hmm. And so that leads to the next part of the story, which is as I'm hitting 15, 16, I was at that age not particularly aware of international events or the news, but for those who lived through that era, the early 1970s, the Vietnam War is ever present on TV, news, magazines, newspapers, or simply knowing people from your town or neighborhood who had, brother or a son serving in Vietnam. And so come 1979, the news story that was in the international headlines was the refugee crisis on the Thai-Cambodian border. After the Vietnam War ended in 1975, the Cambodian communists, who were distinct and different from the Vietnamese communists, also overthrew their government and undertook a radical restructuring of society that ultimately led to starvation and even genocide. In 1979, those refugees are finally breaking through the Thailand border, coming into Thailand, and it was sort of the international crisis of the moment. And at that point, my concern for what was going on in the world and suffering elsewhere, combined with me feeling like I was in this isolated pod where nobody seemed to be suffering and nobody seemed to care about this stuff, I had this overwhelming compulsion that I had to get myself to Thailand. I had to get myself to those refugee camps. So I was 17 years old, midway through my senior year in high school. I talked to my parents, tell them that this is how I feel, this is what I want to do. They're supportive, and they said, can you volunteer with any organization? And I said, well, this is pre-internet, pre-computers, but I'd done my homework and called some agencies, and nobody wants a 17-year-old, who has no language abilities, no medical training. No one's going to fly you internationally to do the work. So not surprisingly, everyone politely shut me down. But I said, no, I'm going to buy a ticket and I'm going to get myself there and I'll figure it out when I'm there. And of course my parents say, no, we can't, that's too risky. It is a war zone after all. If you can hook up an organization, great. If not, you're gonna have to wait until go to college and we'll do this. We'll support you in doing this later. So I just did it on my own. I left a note for my parents, bought a one-way ticket to Thailand, got on a plane, and within a week after landing, managed to get myself a job as a volunteer with a relief team on the Cambodian border.
Wow. I'm in shock because one, I wouldn't I mean, how did you get a passport?
I guess I'm more resourceful than I realized. I had traveled internationally once with my parents in 1971. They took my brother and me to England. So I had a passport. Actually, it was back in those days you could get combined passports. My brother and I were on the same passport, but that was enough for me to go down to a post office and say I'd like my own passport, and they tell me what I need, pictures and so forth. Even skipped school for one day, went up to Boston to get a visa from the Thai consulate. All sort of, my parents are not aware of any of this. So yeah, the logistics, and then I had then from a after school job I called Geneva, Switzerland. I don't know how I figured out that, well, the UN, and there was a United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. So I called that cold, told them what I wanted to do, and a guy, I remember his name 45 years later, Mr. Lean from the UNHCR said, well, I don't recommend you do what you're thinking of doing, but if you do, here's a list of 8 or 10 agencies, their addresses, their telephone numbers, and their directors. So when you get there, you knock on these doors. Yeah, so somehow this very crazy plan worked. I should not skip that when I landed in Thailand, called my parents to collect, the first thing my father said to me over a very echoey international call that I had to make from the general post office in Bangkok only lasted about 3 minutes, probably cost my parents $100. My dad said, we'll talk about how you got there some other time. But now that you're there, do what you went to do. And by the way, we've spoken to the U.S. Embassy there. Stop by and see a consular officer, and he'll help introduce you to some of these agencies. And that's how I got the job. So credit to my parents for, reacting, adjusting on the fly to I'm a parent, one of the most difficult challenges after me nearly killing myself in the backyard of my home, adjusting quickly and being supportive. And that did lead to me getting the first job I had, which was on the Cambodian border in My Route was the name of the camp.
That's an incredible story in and of itself. First of all, the ambition that you had is astonishing to me. Like, I wish that I had that bravery and ambition in things in my life, and especially as a kid. When I say a kid, you were what, 16, 17 years old?
17, yeah.
And then I wish I would have the patience that your dad had, because if that happened to my child, I would freak out. I'm not
Yeah.
gonna lie, like I would be freaking out.
So my parents are still alive, thankfully, and have lived to see this memoir be published, and I'm so glad they are, because a number of people who've read it have had said something like you just said. Oh, good for you. Look what you did. But fortunately, so many people are saying your parents were wonderful in the context of trauma. I mean, they were not unaware. We had talked about why I wanted to do it, and even at a young age, I tied it directly to the trauma. I said, I need to do this to cope. And so that I do want to flag when you cited bravery and patience and so forth. From my perspective, I didn't have a choice. I felt compelled to do it. Now, an interesting question for us to leave hanging out there is, many people over the years, when they say, people hear bits of the story or someone tells them, and everyone wants to know, why did you run away from home at age 17 to, of all places, the Thai-Cambodian border, the killing fields? And I say, well, it was because I was burned, and it was one of my ways of coping. And I do remember a childhood friend who knew me through all of this, and she says, yeah, a lot of kids are traumatized, but they don't do what you did. So I guess that's the mystery in the mix. In my book, by the way, was an exercise for myself. I think much of memoir is, but also for my family and close friends. I never seemed to satisfy anyone with that short version that I just gave you. And the book was an effort to really help you get inside my head and see things how I saw them at that young age, and why it was so clear to me that I had no choice, that I had to do it. It had nothing to do with bravery and from my perspective. And I had no illusions that I was going to save the world. Quite the contrary. I felt, suffering was unavoidable. in the world, not necessarily for every individual at the same level, but and then I needed to respond to it. It was really, I needed to do that to cope. And that's one perspective that, as I look back over 40 years later, I still have the same perspective. It was all about coping.
So you truly believe that your decision, like your decision to respond to that situation, came from the trauma, came from what you experienced with the burn. Like it wasn't. I mean, obviously, you're an ambitious person to be able to do that kind of thing, but for you, the fact that you went there and you felt compelled to go there, you feel like it came directly from that trauma.
100%. And I would go further than that because I don't know if other people who are traumatized as children play this. I'm not a what if kind of guy. My wife gets on me all the time. She says, what if this, or what if we had done this? And I go, no, I don't live my life that way, with one exception. I do find myself saying, what was the core of who I was before the trauma? I do ask myself that question from time to time. And I think, I got to be honest with you, I think my inherent nature is not necessarily all that passionate or all that ambitious, and tends, if anything, slightly to laziness. And if you saw my full CV, you'd go, no, that doesn't make any sense. 100% of that, what you might call ambition, was really the path that my trauma started me on. I think my career could be, summarized by saying I was finding different ways to try to contribute and respond. Again, not to save the world, but to see other people who are suffering and who are in need, and not solving their problems, but could at least see them, recognize them, recognize their dignity, let them know that at least I was listening, at least I was here if I did no more than that. And I still do that professionally. As a primary care doctor, I can't solve all the problems my patients come in to see me. But sometimes it's so important. Yes, we started for people to tell their story and for someone to hear it. That in and of itself, before it goes any further, is so important. So that my whole career really, if you look at it through that lens, starts to make sense. Yeah.
So when you got there, all of the resources that they had given you, like the doors to knock on, the U.S. Embassy, did you visit these places? Did you go to these places and knock on those doors when you got there? Or can you explain to us a little bit, like, I'm trying to
Sure.
envision this as a 17-year-old kid. You get off the airplane, you call your parents. Where do you go from there?
So as I had mentioned, when I had that call with my father, he mentions there's a counselor officer that he's talked to, and he said, I know you left. I left in my letter to them that I had these names of these agencies. He said, well, go talk to him because he might know some of those people. Maybe he can put in a good word for you. And that's in fact what happened. And so the very first agency that I arranged to meet with, a man named David Lewis, who was overseeing a Catholic. I wasn't raised Catholic, or I was raised Congregationalist, but nevertheless oversaw a Catholic relief operation in Thailand, agreed to meet with me. And let me tell you, the memoir gives credit where it's due. I think people hear the story of a 17-year-old kid who gets over, and we haven't even gotten to the point before I leave on that first trip, I'm working for the U.S. Embassy. It's a very unlikely story. But the reason I succeeded was not because of my grit or determination or great talent. The reason I succeeded was so many people were kind to me and were maybe struck by my sincerity, that he didn't need me on his border team, but there I was, and the embassy had sort of vouched for me, my parents had vouched for me, and so off I go out to the Cambodian border on one of his teams. This was a early period in the refugee crisis. In any refugee crisis, especially resulting from a war, the early period is utterly chaotic. And when I got down to the border, the camps were just being set up, and the refugees had only arrived across the border in the previous months. So, the trauma was still fresh. The fear of being forcibly pushed back into Cambodia, which was happening, back into, the killing fields, was real. And at the time when I arrived in this camp, there were not many Americans in that particular camp. The team I was sent down with was 4 Catholic nuns from New York City, who were in their 60s, who had never been overseas. And they got assigned to set up a sewing center, and they went about sort of focusing on that. I really didn't have any fixed duties when I first arrived, which allowed me on my first moments to just start wandering into the camp and interacting with the people as I found them. And this was, again, another one of these life-changing moments that, the first day in the camp, I almost can replay it like a movie in my mind. By the way, I can replay the day I was burned like a movie in my mind. I mean, some of your life experiences are so intense. The image and recollection that they leave in your brain is crystal clear. I have to say, the thing that's, looking back all these years, it struck me is it was clear that the people had been traumatized and been through so much that many were still malnourished. Many were still frightened, but the resilience, the strength, the generosity, the curiosity, the affection, the kindness, just wrapped itself around me. And it was a very important, affirming, positive experience on my journey. Now, mind you, I worked on that border on and off for the next 5 years. I can't begin to recount the number of trauma stories I've heard from survivors of the killing fields. And the next thing that happened is I got overwhelmed by these stories. And again, I just told you, at that period, I'm the one American in this particular camp. There were in a neighboring camp 2 American missionaries, but the camp I was in, which had the newest refugees, for a period of time there, I was the only American that they had access to, so that people were literally lining up, wanted to tell me their stories. They felt a need to, often their first telling to an outsider. It's a very fresh and raw survival stories. So it's a combination of inspiration by their character, by their affection. By the way, Cambodian culture before the war, it's a lovely culture. And the people by nature are very welcoming and friendly. But then, they were grateful to have made it to the border. They were grateful to be able to meet me and tell me of their experiences. But it was a wash of, it was all overwhelming. I keep coming back to that word, overwhelming. And I think, as you understand better than maybe many people who hear the story, I couldn't have been more sensitized to hearing about other people's trauma. I'm 17. I haven't really come to terms with my own trauma, and I'm hearing people tell these stories that make my trauma story look like a scratch. So that was a challenge. I was in the deep end of the pool, way over my head, but again, with a lot of good role models, some of the relief workers that I worked with, but some of the older refugees who had survived so much, these people really helped me on my journey. The memoir does focus a lot on a not largely nonverbal relationship I had with a mother, a widow, who had just lost her husband to the Khmer Rouge. And she was there with her 7 children, all under the age of 18, the oldest one being my age, the youngest being 4. And she's the one who affected me most profoundly. One, she made an effort. Well, everyone was trying to get to know me, but she succeeded in breaking through the crowd and getting me to notice her. And also, she had a wonderful sense of humor. I should say part of my personality that predates my accident is, I was a bit of a clown or a silly guy. And I was struggling. In high school, I was still the class clown, but it was sort of a darker version. I was still trying to hold on to that. I thought that was such an important part of who I was, and just an important part of coping with life in general, trauma or no. And here she was, having survived all of that, and she had the wickedest sense of humor and loved to laugh, even though she was scared to death and worried for her children and desperate to know how she could survive the next steps. That, again, just life-changing relationship that was formed there. And by the way, her family and my family, they're in the United States now. They're like my own siblings. This was the beginning of a long and deep and profound relationship.
Wow, that's just incredible. That's what a story. They almost need to make a movie about your story because it's
Well,
an incredible.
if you know anyone to pitch that to, let me know. The power of the story uh, is there on so many levels, and I think the cross-cultural aspect of it is an important one. That period of history is not well known. There are now, 300,000 or 400,000 Cambodian Americans who now live in the United States, as well as several million Vietnamese and so forth. That era of the refugee program, it's now part of America's story. And the cross-cultural aspect is still relevant, and relevant to things going on in the world today. But I would say, as I still look at the news, right? And what I still see in the daily news, and you see it too, is trauma that continues to happen. And I don't know, I have no expertise in how we're going to prevent that. But I do have some experience and expertise on, do we acknowledge it? Do we recognize it? Do we try to do something? As little, and I think we keep coming back to this point, do we? The least you can do is hear someone's story.
I totally agree with you. And I think too, like this idea, which you've talked about, the innate idea that you had as a child or as a, young man, teenager, to go there and like, I didn't expect to change the world. You said, I just wanted to go there and like help. And I think because sometimes I know even with this podcast, I have had this vision of like, I truly want to help people. I want to help people. And I think if I can help, 5 people and they go help 5 people, it spreads, right?
Yes,
So, but it still becomes overwhelming at times. Like if you are not, it's like, if I want to go impact the world, that's an overwhelming thought. But
right,
if I have my goal like right in front of me, who can I make their life better today? Who can I call and inspire, encourage? Who can I, if sometimes even when I don't even look at the numbers on this podcast, to
right,
be honest
right.
with you, because
Yeah,
I don't do it for the numbers. I
right,
do it for if one episode impacts one person, if one person is impacted per episode, I've done what I need to do. And I think if we can focus on that, it's worth it. And I think if we can't, sometimes we can get overwhelmed and if we stall. We feel like, oh, I can't do this. So I think there's definitely that, like a reason for growth and a reason for doing the things that are put on our heart. I definitely think pursuing those things is important. And then as far as just we live in a culture that is constantly like negative, and we need to be aware of what's happening, but we also, our human nature requires positive
yes.
thinking, positive perceptions, positive people, positive everything all around us. So I think that that's another thing too, where it's just like we have to start surrounding ourselves with more positivity. And if you can't find that positivity, you have to create that positivity in your mind.
Yes,
And I think if
yes.
we can get people to understand that, suddenly it helps start to overcome some of the trauma that we've experienced. I mean, I don't have all the answers, but those are just a couple of my thoughts when it comes to overcoming trauma, in a wide population.
Well, I think there's a number of things you said that I completely agree with. And, I've been fortunate in my career that, especially mid and late career, I've been able to participate in some efforts that are, more widespread, might affect more people. But I've always wondered, and in moments of self-reflection on my work, where did I have the most impact? And I still keep coming back to individual one-on-one interactions that were small. I think at the end of the day, um, at least I feel that's where I've had more success and more to contribute. I may be wrong about that, but it feels that way. And maybe it's because as people at the end of the day, if you give population statistics, it's hard to wrap your arms around that. but I can remember clinical encounters or when I volunteered or when I helped someone. I remember those moments of appreciation. And again, I come back to, I think what you've been saying, it's as simple as recognizing someone, giving them your attention. The human connection, I think, is one of the takeaways, I think, from your work and mine, that it's tough enough. And we talked about what's isolating about trauma, and particularly childhood trauma. So it does require some effort, but making human connections, I think, is one of the key strategies. One, as time goes on, you start to realize you're not as alone as you thought you were. You're not as unique as you thought you were. Your trauma story will probably always remain unique, but you start to see that other people have their own struggles, and and you can find ways to connect with them or engage with them or relate to them, that weren't apparent to you when you started the journey, especially if you started the journey as a child.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, completely. I agree with you there. There is something to the human connection and connection to nature. I think that,
Yes,
energetically, we are all connected. And I think to avoid that is to avoid our natural inclination to live in the world,
yes,
quite frankly.
yeah.
So I
I
love all of
completely
that.
agree.
I want you to tell us a little bit about like how this now you're a physician, you work with people, you're doing a lot of amazing things in the world. And so this trip, do you think what you're doing now hinges on that trip, or do you think it's all been a series of events that's led you up to what you're doing now?
Yeah, I definitely feel it's all connected. Early in my career, I guess I didn't recognize it. I remember I was talking at a student conference, and I said I've had this interesting but very disjointed career because I started in refugee work, and then I worked in community health centers in the Mississippi Delta, and then I worked in jails and prisons, and then I worked on human rights issues. And it felt to me like I was jumping around a lot. And one of the students said, "No, you're you're always responding to people who other people either don't see or don't know how to engage with or don't want to engage with." That just, the student who's just in the audience goes like, "I see what all these things have in common," and I go, "Oh, yeah, I think you're right." So, now from the perspective of my early '60s, no, it's all related, and it is all of one piece. If I went to work, I did have to feel like I was addressing something that maybe would have been overlooked or not as addressed as thoroughly. Always trying to find that space. And interestingly enough, when I have successes and maybe other people start to follow and other people pick up the cause, I do in my career move on to the next thing when I feel like, okay, now that has attention, now people are responding to it. And that might explain some of my career shifts over time. But no question, it's all related uh, to the burn, which led me to the refugee camps, which led to the rest of my career.
Mm. And it's just amazing how life journey can take you down this path and lead you to exactly what your destiny, what you're called here to do. I mean, that's my belief system anyway. I definitely believe that we all have a destiny, we all have a purpose, we all have a reason that we're here. And finding that is so valuable. And I think if you can find it early, it's it is, I mean, you go through life's journey enjoying the process because you're living within those boundaries of your destiny. And I think that's beautiful. However, I do want to say this too. For some people, like myself, for example, it took me many years to discover what that purpose was, what that, where I kind of fit in. I felt like I didn't really ever fit in. So there's, in other words, some people you can find that really early in life. Other people, it takes a little bit longer. Don't beat
Right.
yourself up one way or the other. But to be able to tap into that is powerful. So don't stop until you find what you're put here to do.
Yeah, and I do believe that is a lifelong journey. I agree. There, there are anecdotes to support I had some aspects of my vision fairly clear at a fairly young age. But no, it's been a lifelong journey. I feel like, I'm not done with it. I feel like I'm still learning, moving further, hopefully growing with wisdom and insight and getting closer, certainly more at peace. I don't think we've maybe talked about that enough, because the, adolescent version of me had a tremendous internal turmoil. And I would feel like at stages, say by my maybe mid-20s, I felt like I was in control. I felt like I had some mastery. And we haven't talked about it, time probably doesn't permit, but there were key moments in my life where the trauma came roaring back, and I would be overwhelmed and collapse. And it would surprise people around me, because they thought like, oh, I thought you were so done with that. That's so far in your past. And that's another part of the journey. But I think we both keep coming back to this idea that it is a long journey. I don't think you master it ever, but certainly not master it completely early on. And I go back to that primitive coping techniques that slowly over time, if you're lucky, get replaced by better coping techniques. You're learning from others, you're gaining wisdom, you're seeing things that work better. So at 62, I feel a whole lot better than I did. I wouldn't wind back the clock if I, for anything, even to, be younger and feel healthier in terms of youth. No, I lived every day. I paid for every day. I'm happy to be where I am.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I don't think we're ever done growing and learning until we take our last breath, and then we're
I
done.
agree.
I do think too, we're given a choice as human beings. And I think that and this goes back to trauma specifically, we have the option and the choice to choose to grow from that trauma, excel, create something beautiful from it, because it's ugly. A lot of times the trauma that we've experienced is very ugly, but it can, like the analogy of like a butterfly, like it's in the cocoon, like, it's not really pretty at first, but then it grows into this beautiful manifestation of a insect, or I don't know if it's an insect or an animal or whatever, but it grows into this butterfly, and it's beautiful. And I think that our trauma we can certainly do that with our trauma, but it does take sometimes making a conscious effort and an intentional determination that I am going to become aware of it and I'm going to heal from it. And whatever that looks like, maybe it is going into helping other people. Maybe it's a self-exploration to yourself. Maybe it's combination.
Right.
Maybe it's exploring different modalities. But if we have the power to make that choice, then we can make the choice and we can grow from it. And it can grow into something so beautiful and so inspirational in the world.
The metaphor is a nice one, because, the caterpillar is crawling on the leaf, and then when it emerges as a butterfly, needs to learn how to live in the world in an entirely new way, because now it flies.
I love that.
Yeah, well, that's your metaphor. I'm just picking up on it and saying that's what it meant to me, because I was thinking as you were saying that a lot, there's so many solutions as you and I are allowing. I told you I will tell you one story, if it's helpful to you, but it's just one story. But the essence of it, I think, is I had to figure out how to live in this world knowing what I knew about trauma. And the rest of the story is my journey of getting there, of finding a way to move forward. And that way forward is going to be unique to every individual. As you said, it's probably about finding your purpose. And anyway, that's what I think I've learned to do, and at least made it this far, and I'm still on the journey.
Mm-hmm. And I love that. And I think it's true for everybody. And
Yes.
that's why I love these stories, because I truly feel like when someone can share these stories of like, this was my trauma, this was me, like, and it wasn't pretty and it was hard and I grew from it. But now this is where it's brought me to. And it's so important for people to see that, because I've said this and I brought this up on the podcast before, but it's been like, if someone looks at you, Like, I can't see the scars. Of course, we're on video, but I
Right.
I can't see through the camera. Um, I wouldn't notice any scars. I notice, I know you're a doctor from what I know about you, but I would never look into you and say, "Oh, he's experienced this," unless
Right.
you share it.
That's right.
And
Absolutely true.
it's so easy for us to, like, pass people just in passing on the street, in the grocery store, whatever, driving down the road, you look over to the next car. You have no idea what this person's experienced until they start speaking about their experience. And so it just opens up a whole new awareness in our world, and it gives people hope. The story, the experience, the trauma, it gives others hope when you start to share. So it's so vital. I think it's just so important. And it's so interesting. Like, your story is so interesting. I'm so glad you've written these memoirs or this memoir about your story, because it's that's like a lot of people can't even wrap their mind around it. I certainly can't.
Well, I hope it's at least of interest and maybe useful to some folks, and that's why it's out there.
What's your vision for the future? Like, if you've seen yourself in a year, 2 years, 5 years, what does that look like?
Well, the interesting thing about writing the memoir is I'm not known for my trauma story. I'm known for all of the professional accomplishments I've had. And I feel in a way I've sort of now outed myself as a childhood trauma survivor. And I mean, again, because it burns people who interact with me. My right hand in particular is very clearly deformed and has burn scars. And if you see me in shorts, my legs and so forth, more obvious than the face. But I don't think they totally tie it to who I am and why I am the way I am. So it was an outing of my own more personal story. And just in the short time since the memoir is out, I've had more conversations similar to what we've had, but a wide variety of conversations with people I wouldn't have otherwise connected to. And people seem to be drawing um, lessons or inspiration or whatever from hearing the story, engaging with me. That's a whole new journey for me. And I'm delighted that you and I were able to share this hour on that journey, because I'm finding that to be fascinating, rewarding. Um, it's like anything to kind of acknowledge your true self more publicly. And I'll tell you, I do have colleagues and friends who don't know what to do with it because it's not the plane they interact with me. They're used to this very highly competent professional who seems cool and in control at all times. And I'm sharing with you that no, that was certainly not always the case. But it's nice to get out, just admit that you're human and have other people respect that and interact with you on that level. It's delightful. So I don't know where that will take me. You know, I still work as a physician. I still work on health issues. I still work on human rights issues. Um, I don't know where the journey takes me next, but it's been a wonderful journey, and we'll see. Time will tell.
Hmm. And sometimes it's just, I like to call it blind faith. I don't know if that's the right word
Yeah,
for it, but it is
yeah,
kind
sure.
of where you put
I
one
think
foot
it
in front
is.
of the other, and you just say, "Hey, I'm just gonna go follow my heart. Where my
Yeah,
heart
and have
leads
some
me."
faith,
Hmm.
that will be a meaningful journey. I agree.
Absolutely. So, if you had something that you would like leave our audience with, like final thoughts or big takeaways, or what what would you say that you would like to leave our listeners with?
Well, let me just say, as I listened to some of your other episodes on your wonderful podcast, and often your guests will have very clear answers and direction. I thought, boy, I can tell my story. I don't know what advice I have, but the point of the book, and the book does close with this, is for me at least the key I found to live in the world that I now saw clearly from age 10, a world of so much suffering. The key for me, if we're come down to one word, was compassion. Practicing compassion. It really is the essence of what you and I have been talking about this whole hour. And to me, not to do it because it's the right thing to do. For me, it's what allowed me to cope and live and make peace with this world. And it led to every meaningful job outcome I had, every meaningful relationship I had. It was the essence of my healing path. So, it's again, that's that turn, start inward. I've done tons of internal reflection. That's very healthy and normal. But at some point, you got to turn outward and reconnect yourself with the rest of humanity. And compassion for me, I'll just say that. I don't want to dictate to anyone else or be prescriptive to anyone else. But compassion for me was the key to my healing.
I love that. And I think that that's true on a lot of levels. Having compassion and having empathy and being able to understand. You can't walk in someone else's shoes, but to understand
Correct.
what they've dealt with,
Yep.
or at least try to understand.
At least try. So true.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you so much. I thank you so much for sharing with us today. I know that your story is going to impact so many people. I mean, it's inspired me just talking to you. Like, man, what an incredible journey you've been through. And what a beautiful manifestation of trauma to triumph. It really is. And I just can't thank you so much for just sharing with us today.
Well, thank you for hosting the podcast and putting it all together. Again, I think you're doing such a service, and I wish you all the best in your career, and I'll follow it.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate that. And same here. So we'll stay connected for sure. And I'll put all of his information in the show notes too, and ways to get your hands on the memoir.
Terrific. Thank you again.
Thank you for listening to Through the Trauma podcast. If you have found value in this episode or believe in the mission behind what we are doing, please subscribe so that you never miss any future episodes. Also, be sure to check out our transformation project at transformationthroughtraumaproject.com, where we help inspirational stories get heard on a larger scale through multiple platforms. If you know someone who can benefit from this episode, please share it with them. Until next time.